Hello. Today I'm going to start talking about value, and we're going to play with value with painting media and also with drawing medium. And I want to explore and explain to you why it's important to understand value and why it's used. So I have this white piece of paper here. You can see it's just a flat piece of paper, and it is the same sort of value, this light color. Now, when I start bending this piece of paper, you can see, and I have a window, you can see I have some windows here on the side. You can see that the light is hitting it, then there's some blockage of the light, so it gets darker, and then it gets even darker as it moves away from the light, and then this last one here is the furthest away from the light, so it gets really dark. So when we start talking about value, we start talking about an object's relationship to light and shadow and space. So when you don't change your value in your paintings and your drawings, you're essentially drawing a flat space. But when you start including darks, lights, and grays into your pieces, you start to explain something to your viewers about life. All right, so we're going to continue our conversation on value, the relationship of light to dark. And we're going to do a couple of different things. So I have a little bit of titanium white, Liquitex I like, or golden products are pretty good with the pigment. And then I have a little Mars black Liquitex, which I also like. You can use bone black or carbon black. It doesn't really matter. If you're going to be using a Payne's gray, some people use that as a black, and it can be sort of bluish. So you want to be sort of aware of that when you're mixing your colors. I always have like a paper towel nearby. I'm using a Grumbacher number 6 watercolor brush. You're really not supposed to use your brushes to mix colors, but whatever. So now value. So how you can think about value is the relationship of light to dark. I always like to start with like giving myself a little swatch of white. And then you're slowly just going to add just the tiniest bit of black into it. Now see how dark this already is? It's really not going to give me like a sort of minimal stepping. So I'm going to take it back a little bit and add a little bit more white to it. So then we have a sort of nice little step. And then again, you can wash your brush in between just to make sure that it's nice and clean. You can wipe it off on your little paper towel. And then we've already mixed this darker value. And the one thing you want to be wary about is if something is transparent with acrylic, you're going to get the white of the page. And so you want to make sure that you're painting it very opaquely if you really want to get a clear, clean sense of the value. If it's translucent, then the white of the page will come through and make the color lighter. So we have a white, a gray, and then we can keep adding just little bits of this black and slowly get darker and darker. And I'm giving it a sort of a quick step, but you could make it so that there really was no seams. It could be seamless in steps. Okay, so we're just giving ourselves a couple of steps in value from light to dark. And eventually you would just get to the black. Straight black. So this is one way to create value, either just mixing the acrylic paints together or whatever kind of paints you have together. You can also do it through that idea of transparency. So I'm going to turn my little thing around. And I'm going to start with just the black, sort of straight out of the tube. You have the black. Now if I add more water to it, I'm going to allow some more of the air or a light to come through. If I even add more water to it, I can make it even more transparent. Add more water. And I like acrylic. Acrylic has a lot of neat properties that I don't think are actually utilized enough, that it can be sort of like watercolor. So again, you could get right down to just the white of the page. So in this example, I'm mixing white and black together to create values. In this example, I am just sort of using the translucency, so that I'm using the white of the page coming through a translucent wash to create different values. So that's one way. Two ways you can do it. I'll get another piece of paper here. So another way that you can sort of create transitions in value is the relationship of how close the marks are together. So if I do a couple of dots on a page, and you saw how that paint is sort of bleeding into that drop of water. So if I build up dots on a page, how close they are together is going to create a particular type of value. If I then make less dots, or dots that are sort of further away from each other, it's going to have the sense of a lighter value. And then you keep on going. So dots that are even further away from each other, and then you can go back and even lay over the dots again, and to the point where they'd be so thick and so close together that they would be similarly black. So the relationship, and this is something that we do actually in cross-hatching. So again, if we put some lines down onto a page, and I'm using paint, but you could use markers, crayons, oil pastels, and this is sort of cross-hatching here with the paint. And it's the same concept of items or marks that are close together are going to feel and seem darker than compared to marks that are further away from each other. And again, you can always go back and add more. You see this technique a lot with, you see this happening right now with people are sort of writing words or letters or using dice to sort of create values, and it's the amount of darks and lights that are next to each other and how close they are together that are creating the value. And again, just the further away and the lighter, you can see that they have a sense of value. All right, so we have the mixed value with the actual black and white to create variations. We have translucency and opacity we're using to our advantage to sort of create different values. This idea of creating sort of marks and dots close together. So the closer the marks are together, the darker they're going to appear. The further apart they are, the lighter in value. And then this sort of old school sort of cross-hatching with the lines doubling up, overlapping to create a darker area, and then using less of the lines overlapped and getting them further away from each other and in lighter sort of variations to create the lightest value. All right, so now we're going to take this concept of light and dark and we're going to apply it to some shapes. And so how that creates light, planes, form, shadow, life. So let's start with the clear, this idea of this transparency. Transparent paint. I'm going to start with a little lightness. I'm just going to start with a little bit of a circle, a little circle with this light wash, and this is acrylic here. And I'm going to add just a little bit sort of in the middle. You can see how acrylic does act like watercolor. It will move and bleed and bloom into a wet area. So I'm just slowly adding a little bit more of this sort of watered down black acrylic paint. Moving it around, and you can see how it starts to develop a sense of light and darkness. I'm getting a little bit more opaque, slowly building up this sphere. And this allows for the sense of volume. So now we start talking about how light, shadow, light and dark create form. So there you go. Now we have this sort of sphere. So let's do it. This was the translucent or transparent idea, opaque versus translucent, to create a sense of light and darkness. Now let's do it with mixing the paint. So here's a little black, and I'm just going to sort of play with creating a little bit of a line on the bottom here. I'm not going to go on the top part of the circle. And the other thing, when we start talking about form, light, and space, there's a couple of rules, some different things that we want to think about. So there's always this idea that there is a reflected light. So if the light is coming from this direction and hitting this object, there's going to be the lightest part. It's going to move through as it moves away from the light. And then essentially there's this idea that this light hits something over here and reflects back to the object. So I'm taking a dry brush just to sort of like remove some of this paint on the back here to lighten it up. You can even take, because it's sort of, we're playing with this watery technique, you can even take a little sort of balled up piece of paper towel and pick it up, sort of remove it. So then you can play with this idea of reflected light coming back off of the back end of this piece. And then if you want to go back in and bring some of that light idea and shadow, you can bring some more of that watery sort of acrylic paint in there. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now let's get back to the mixing part. So I'm starting with a little black paint, and I just sort of bring the bottom of this sphere together. I'm gonna add just a little dab will do ya for making it a little lighter. And I'm gonna move this up and pretend that I'm sort of being tactile about touching this sphere. See how I'm moving my brush as if it was touching a sort of rounded object. Again, go back in, adding a little bit more white. And what I love about acrylic is that you can just go right over it if there's a mistake or any kind of sort of, you want to change a color or change a value, just let it dry and then go right over it. And I'm going to sort of bring this gray color right now over here on this back side for that reflective light again. I might go back and add it a little bit lighter later, but we'll see what happens. So I'm just adding more and more of this lighter white into this black to make it a lighter value. keep going, adding this light. And I'm not looking at anything, I'm inventing this in my head. So if you were actually looking at an object, maybe the light would be coming from a different direction, or it would have, maybe a lot of times a light will have sort of like a yellowish quality to it. We're just using the black and white, and as we move forward in this video, I'm going to show you then how to sort of mix the values with color. We're just getting the basics of this, moving the value with just black and white. So I'm adding a little bit more. And again, you can see I just sort of kept building it, slowly adding until eventually it becomes, and there's this idea of a highlight. So where the light actually hits it directly on the object. And you may go back in, I'm just rinsing my brush. So say there's this sort of like weird edge here. You can always just go back in and start attacking or negotiating the negative space, the space around an object. That's what I also love about acrylic, is that you can just sort of go right over and clean things up. You might even want to go back in, say if you did this technique at the top, maybe you want to kind of go in with that highlight. You can just go in with the white just to clean it up and give it a little bit of a highlight if you'd like. And like I said, I might go back. I feel like this needs just a little bit more of this highlight, the reflective highlight in the back here. And so I like this idea of negotiating paints, playing with it to make it look like how you want. Getting it closer and closer to this idea of form, space, this three-dimensional object in space. And when I move around this object in this way, and I move the paint in the direction of the paint, it's called modeling. So like you're modeling it, almost as if you're sort of pushing around clay, but you're pushing around the paint to get it to feel rounded. Just trying to make this a really smooth transition between the lights and the darks to get it to feel round like a three-dimensional object. So there we go. So now this is the translucency we're using. And again, acrylic does love to be layered, so as you continue to sort of work it and play with it, you may want to go over some areas. And then let's now do this idea of sort of things being close together are going to be darker, and as they are farther apart, they become lighter in value. So let's do some lines. Let's start. I'm just giving myself a general idea where this sphere is in space. And then I'm just going to start loading it up with some dots. And I may have to go in and use a little white for the reflective shadow. And I'm using my tool sort of in a lighter way. I'm not pushing down as much. And what might help this feel more three-dimensional is manipulating the space behind it. So instead of focusing on painting the object, maybe I'll paint the space behind it. So then now the lightest or the highlight of the object now becomes lighter because I painted the space around it darker. And I painted it quite dark actually. You could go in and paint it a lighter gray. I kind of, you know how there's sort of heavy-footed drivers. I'm like a heavy-footed painter. I sort of go a little bit too quick, too fast. I always have to pull myself back. So again, even just creating even a lighter background, it's still the white of the page now becomes sort of the highlight. And we can start talking about the negative space, painting around the object so that we're cutting and carving this space out. And if we wanted the space to move, we would have to negotiate the space. We want to get the eye to move, and somehow consecutive or progression is a good way to get the eye to move, meaning if there's something changing slowly, it will get the eye to move. Notice how just by sort of changing the values out in the space, it creates this sort of movement, like it makes sense as it moves away from this object. It's sort of blending into the white of this page. Maybe I go around this sphere. Let's see, let's focus back in on this guy. So I'm going to go in with a little bit of black again, and I want to double up down here at the bottom. Make that darker. And I'm making the marks smaller and further apart as I move up, as I want this to be seemingly lighter. And I got to go back in. You can see how kind of wonky this sphere is. So I'm going to go back into this sort of gray and see if I can kind of negotiate that. There you go. To make it feel a little bit more grounded, of a grounded sort of piece. Now let's see, I don't know if this is going to work. Let's test it out. Sometimes it's all a gamble. Let's see if I can take some wet. I'm just taking water right here at the bottom, and I'm moving it around. I want to see if I can sort of lift up the acrylic. Let's see, we'll do it together. I'm going to take a little piece of paper towel. Oh yes, it does kind of. And I think it's because this watercolor paper, it's sort of bubbling up a little bit. But that's okay, it's doing what I want. It's giving me that reflected light, sort of bringing back the white of the page, which is nice. And then I can keep going in and sort of darkening the areas that I want with these little dots. Darker area. And then less dots further apart for where it's getting lighter. And then leaving that sort of white at the top there for the highlight. So you can see some different ways to get something to feel like there is light, shadow, space, and volume just by using these different techniques. I'm going to call this the transparent. This is actually mixed with black and white. And then this is this idea of sort of cross-hatching, where the items that are closer together are going to feel darker, and as they move away from each other, they're going to be lighter. And then we use that technique in creating the sphere. All right, so the next thing we're going to show you is how to manipulate value within a color, not just black and white. Okay, so now we've gone through creating value with lights and darks just using grays and blacks and whites, and just this idea of transparency or using cross hatching, and then also mixing white and black together to create various grays. And so now we're going to talk about using black and white with a color. I'm using a little bit of this vivid red orange Liquitex. Again, Liquitex and Golden are my favorites. They sort of have nice pigment quality, they hold up, and you can mix the colors for quite a long time before they get muddy. All right, so now when you put something down right out of the tube, it's going to have a value by itself before adding white or black. And so we put that onto the page just to see where it's at. And it's a pretty, orange is a pretty light color, so it's only going to have a few steps before you get to the sort of white where you lose all of the orange in a color. All right, so now I'm going to take a little bit of this orange and I'm going to add a little bit of this white, and now I'm tinting it, making it lighter. I'm going to add a little bit more white and tint it and make it lighter again. And then I continue to add white in slow increments, and that's going to make it lighter. Not to be confused with brighter. Light and bright are two different things. The saturation of the color is going to be at its most intensity right out of the tube. When you start adding things to a color, it breaks down its intensity because you're dispersing the pigment into another medium. So eventually you would get to a very, very light, pale, almost white value. It's really quite beautiful, actually. And then again, so now because orange is a lighter color, you can see we only had a few steps in getting it to almost white. It's going to have a lot more steps when we add black if we do it in small increments. If you add too much very quickly, it will sort of, see again, I just added just the tiniest bit of black and it really did sort of change it. And that's because it has a little bit orange, has a little bit of yellow in it, and yellow is transparent. This orange is slightly transparent on the transparent scale. So it's going to, and the black is not transparent. So it's going to get really dark very quickly. So you have to sort of be very focused and patient, and don't just go and add the black and have it be too black and use it. Go back and mix it. Make sure you have the discipline so that you're really manipulating the paints to your best advantage, to your best ability. So there we go, and now I can go right back into this because it has already the black into it, and it's already the next step. Just adding a little bit of water to get it to move. There we go. And then again, just add just the slightest bit of black. Change the value of this orange. Now we're just adding white and black. We just added white to the orange right out of the tube, and now we're just adding black to that orange right out of the tube. And that's changing its tint and its shade. So regarding its lightness and its darkness regarding black and white. But you can also tone a color down. So in the first examples, we made grays. So we're gonna do that. Now you can see very quickly how gorgeous you can get so many different colors just using white and black to sort of tint or shade a color. Now, what I'm going to do is start mixing oranges into grays. So again, if we think back to our little sort of grayscale, and a gray. I'm going to start with just a lot of white, a little tidbit of black to create just a little bit of a gray tone color. And in that gray, you can add some orange. Now, of course, the amount of orange, you want to kind of keep track of how much of the orange you're putting in there because you want the values to sort of step. So now I have this toned down orange, we'll put here on our palette. And you can see the intensity of this is much lower because we're adding a gray. So in relationship to these sort of oranges that are pretty bright in their intensity level, though when we add white or black, it does manipulate its intensity slightly because we're dispersing the pigment into the medium. And then when we add the gray, the white and the black, look how much more. Now if I take this same gray and I add a little bit more orange to it, obviously there's going to be more of that orange pigment in that gray, so it's going to become more orange, more intense. And if you remember, this orange has a value right out of the tube before you even add white or black to it. So if you keep adding this orange to this gray, not only is it becoming more intense because you're adding more of that orange pigment into that grayed color, you're also adding a lighter, naturally lighter value to that gray. So you can see sort of the variations of that just by adding little bits of gray to that orange. Now you can also, just in the same way that we sort of played with stepping in value, so let's make a sort of darker gray. And let's right here on the palette make a couple of steps here. So we've got that gray, this one's a little bit darker, and then we'll make another sort of darker gray. So you can see right here, there's some step in the value. So then what we can do is add the orange to that. Again, remember how much we add is going to affect the pigment that's dispersed into that gray. It's going to affect how light it gets because this is a lighter color right out of the tube. So I'm going to put that down. And then into the next little stepping of gray, I'm going to add some more of that orange. Gorgeous. And then the last one with the lots of black in it, and just negotiating the orange into it so that it's relative to the other grays, making sure that it doesn't just look gray, it has an orange sort of quality to it. All right, so you can tell now, sort of get the light to hit it. Look at the variations we have in adding, sort of having a gray and adding orange to it, having a sort of light gray, a medium gray, and a dark gray and adding orange to it, and then orange right out of the tube, just adding white, and then orange out of the tube and adding black. Look at the variations we're getting just from these three different colors. So now let's create that sphere. And again, let's keep using this term, the negotiation of painting. So negotiating, how do you make it look sort of real or three-dimensional? Again, if I return right back to this page that I started with, this flat piece of paper, and you can see the sun is hitting it. You can see where my hand is blocking, it gets darker. So we're talking about shade. And then when I move this page, you can see here in this first panel where the light is hitting it, it's the lightest. Now this panel here is the away from the light, it's the darkest panel. And in the middle there, there's that gray that's happening. And you can see a little bit of the light is sort of bouncing off and getting over onto this panel. But this is talking about light in space. This is talking about form. The way that the light is hitting it and where we see it get light and dark, it explains, we visually understand how it moves in space. And so when we're working on a flat two-dimensional space, we have to use this knowledge that we understand visually about how light works around, on top, in, and outside of objects, and how it explains to us how they exist, how it exists in space. All right, so now we're going to use this orange now, and I like to clean my palette with a little, especially when I'm using acrylic. I'll just use a spray bottle. I'll spray it and it will help keep the paint blobs sort of nice and wet. And then I just take a towel and I wipe away. Looks kind of messy at first, but then take another paper towel, wipe away, and then you have a whole nice new space to work with. All right, so let's create that sphere with the orange, white, and black. There's a couple different ways you can do this. Let's do both ways. Let's do it with the orange as sort of like our medium-ish land, and then using the whites to get lighter, and then we'll use orange and blacks to get darker. And then we'll do an example with using it with the grays. Again, there's going to be some negotiations here. I have to sort of play with what we can get. I'm just taking out some of this black paint that got into this pile. All right, so let's start. I'm going to start sort of like in the center, mid part of this sphere. And you can see there was a little drop of water on the page. You could still use the transparency technique even with a color to sort of get the light white of the page to come through to make it seem like it's a lighter value. All right, so we are building up this area, and we're going to start using the white to get it lighter. Again, we're going to negotiate or model this around the object. Move your brush as though it's touching the object in the way that you want it to move through space. Adding a little bit more of this white to that orange to create a lighter value. That white to create a lighter value. And if you paint while it's still wet, like if you keep adding the values while it's still wet, you can sort of like mush it together to create more seamless transitions. Just got the top part of that sphere. Just washing my brush. Again, remember I said that it loves to be layered, so I'm taking a little bit of this white, clean little dab of that orange, so I have the lightest value. I'm going to go in there and pretend that there's a highlight there. And to make this even seem more lighter, it's all about relationships. So I'm trying to get this to feel really light against a white page. So if I go in and I paint around this a darker color, then all of a sudden that sphere becomes so light and poppy because it's the relationship, the contrast against the background there. And I might add just a little bit of water to sort of make it move. And then, sort of towards the bottom here, as I promised, I'm going to take it looks like it's a sphere already together, but I'm going to take a little bit of this orange. I'm going to add just a little bit of this black to it. Again, if you go too quick, like if you got your foot on the gas, then let up. I got a heavy foot or a heavy painter here, so I got to let up. I'm going to go back in around here at the bottom. Again, it's still a little wet, so you can kind of play with it and get it in there. And that was a little too dark, so I'm going to go in and just negotiate it. I'm going to manipulate it, play with it, get it to be more smooth. And you can always go back in. Now see how I had a little bit of black on my brush, so it made that orange pile I had sort of gray, so I didn't want that to happen. So I'm going to make a new little pile so I can go back in here and negotiate that area. And I'm just sort of getting it to transition seamlessly. So that looks pretty good. And then I want this to sort of be a little darker down here. And this I'm just using the tinting and shading. I'm just adding white to the orange and black to the orange for the lights and the darks, not the grays just yet. We'll see what kind of difference it makes. Go back in there with this stuff in here. And then again with the, and see, I'm making this actually darker by adding more orange to it, to that white kind of mix. And then I'm going to go over here and add just a little bit of that black, so I can get back into these darks down here. And again, I'm trying to make this look dark. So how do I do that? Just like how I made this look lighter by making the space dark, I think I'm going to make the space around it lighter. And it would make sense because the light would be hitting here. The light is being blocked, and as it's moving away from the light, it gets darker. So down around here, there probably would be some light areas. So I'm getting that to look darker by putting light around it. And again, I can negotiate this shape by manipulating the negative space the way I want to get that to feel more rounded. And then in this area here, you can see this sort of relationship that's happening between that dark area and the light area. And we can just sort of mix the two together and get sort of a bridge. So there's a seamless transition between this lighter area and dark area by mixing the two together to create a visual bridge to move the eye in the space. All right, and so that's looking pretty good. Again, we want to have a little bit of a reflective light, so I'm just going to go in and just lay down just a little light color. Just a little bit. It doesn't have to be too light, just a little light. And it's actually quite wet right there. So if you have a heat gun or a hair dryer, it's nice to go right over it and dry it up. If you keep just putting wet on top of wet, it's just going to mush together and you'll never get the crisp, clean sort of value that you're trying to sort of pull out. So I'm just going along and creating that little bit of a lick of a sort of reflective light there. That's looking nice. And then I'm going to go back in and paint this area with this similar color. Looks nice. And then I'm going to add a little bit of white here. Just to create the contrast between the object and the space. And again, we can create this visual bridge by mixing the two colors seemingly together. You have to sort of look and see what would be that middle place. So there you go. Now there's this sort of sphere floating in space. It's bouncing right off of the page just by using the values. So now this was just using the method of adding white to a color and then adding black, and then there's this whole idea that you can do it with grays. So let's do that. So let's start with a sort of mid-gray. Going in and mixing this gray. And I'm going to add some orange to it. And that's going to be my base. Let's see if I can whip this one out a little quicker. So that's going to be my base in the middle here. So space by either mixing values, shadows, lights, highlights, sort of reflective light. You can play with methods of mixing actual grays or using translucencies. You can play with the crosshatch method, where objects or marks are close together, and the further apart they are, they become lighter naturally. And then either in your process of painting, you're adding white to tint, black to shade, or you're adding various grays to your oranges to tone them. Thank you so much for watching, and please like my videos and subscribe. If you don't already know, my first 100 subscribers will get a free sticker. These stickers are made from my Fine Art Be a Star series. They're hand-painted little paintings, and I've transformed them into sticker form, and they're just little versions of the larger paintings. Hopefully you liked my video today on value and playing with paint and mixing colors and being able to sort of manipulate space on a flat piece of paper. Please subscribe, please like, and I'll see you again. Thank you.